There is an interesting contradiction, I would argue, that a lot of conservatives in America, a lot of Republicans, have, including a number of presidential candidates from Ron DeSantis to Trump and others, they have signaled that they would want to severely curtail, if not stop altogether, support for Ukraine. And yet Ukraine was invaded by Russia. A lot of people slaughtered, continue to be slaughtered. Is there not a contradiction there that these Republicans would be full square behind Israel when it happens to them, but not full square behind Ukraine?
I mean, yes, there's a contradiction. It depends on sort of what is being said about Ukraine, and it runs the gamut. And some of the candidates that you've talked about have talked about ending aid completely to Ukraine. Some have talked about continuing aid to Ukraine and pursuing some sort of deal with the Russians that allows them to keep part of the Donbass and Crimea, which I think is a completely different story and is an actual off-ramp. But yes, anybody who is sympathetic to Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then is sympathetic to Israel in this current conflict, that is a bizarre position to take. And again, I think that they're serious. America's a sovereign country. It has its own concerns that are not Israel's concerns, and it has its own concerns that are not Ukraine's concerns, and those don't always line up. But when it comes to a possible contradiction between a completely isolationist position on Ukraine and an interventionist position or a supportive position on Israel, of course, those things could clearly be in conflict. In my own position, by the way, for what it's worth, since as you know, Piers, I do this for a living, my own position on Ukraine has been that the United States should continue to supply Ukraine with the support necessary in order to preserve its government and to preserve its territory. And meanwhile, there need to be serious talks about what exactly an off-ramp looks like in Ukraine, because virtually no one has spelled out exactly what that looks like. And virtually no one believes at this point that Ukraine is going to be able to completely take back both the Donbass and the Crimea region. That is not
it's very
nearly the same thing as cut off funding
having
for
been
Ukraine.
to Ukraine and interviewed President Zelensky and met a lot of people there, and that was quite a while ago, there was an unbelievably steely resolve. And I would say the same resolve that Israel has about ceding any land now to the Palestinians. It's like they just don't want to give an inch of land away to the Russians. That was to a man and woman that I met out there.
I have an enormous amount of sympathy for that position. Again, that position does not necessarily dictate American policy any more than Israel's position with regard to, say, the so-called occupied territories, disputed territories, should necessarily dictate America's position on that. There are realistic consequences and concerns to be had on foreign policy. But if the point that you're making is that lack of moral support in an invasion of a sovereign country by Russia is in contradiction with moral support for Israel in this, I would say, there's certainly inconsistency there.
I mean, the other inconsistency and contradiction, it seems to me, is the reaction of the world when George Floyd was murdered, which was a despicable killing. And the police officer concerned is now serving a life sentence, quite rightly. But that sparked enormous global protests over America, over the UK, everywhere, with people marching in protest at what they perceived to be a racist murder of one person. And yet the reaction within hours of what happened here, where, as we knew at the time, nearly 1,000 people in Israel had been murdered, some in the most utterly horrific circumstances. The reaction was that, yes, there were big protests again, but they weren't really protests, they were marches of celebration. In America, in the UK, they marched down my local high street, celebrating what had happened, pro-Palestinian marches. I found that extraordinary.
Jew hatred is a very real thing. It's a very real thing. And we've obscured it with a lot of talk about Zionism and anti-Zionism, and we've obscured it with a lot of talk about geopolitics and context. But in the end, Jew hatred is quite real. And when you see crowds in Sydney chanting, "Gas the Jews," not free the occupied territories, not make a peace deal, gas the Jews, I'm not sure what we're supposed to read into that other than people mean what they say when they say gas the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what they mean. I mean, this is Nazi language. I mean, but as you say, the difference between this and the Nazis tried to keep the secret, whereas this is all in plain sight. I mean, the idea of people doing this in cities like Sydney and London and New York, it's actually terrifying. And I say that again, I'm an Irish Catholic, I'm not Jewish. I feel terrified for Jewish people. Like you say, there's only 15 million Jewish people in the world. It must be, when this kind of thing happens in such an indiscriminate manner, it must be genuinely terrifying for people.
For sure. And obviously when you see marches of support, the question is always asked, how could the Holocaust have happened? And the answer is this way, when people are actively in favor of Jews being murdered simply for being Jews. And again, it's easy to, people have an amazing ability to justify whatever it is that they're thinking or feeling at a given time. But if you can find a way to justify yourself out of the murder of babies in their cribs, I have a hard time figuring that it's anything other than Jew hatred. And so if, you know, as a Jew, as a person who, you know, is very strongly Jewish, I'm very active in my Jewish community, as a person with 4 kids and a wife and parents and sisters and all of this, you know, obviously Jews feel like they are at risk everywhere because of this sort of activity. And I will say there's an amazing double standard when it comes to anti-Semitism and its treatment in the media. The way that it seems to work in the media these days is if somebody politically says something about George Soros, then they will be labeled a Nazi. And if somebody actually says I am a Nazi, then they will say, well, there's probably some sort of justification over territorial disputes.
Yeah. I want to end, Ben, on one positive note, and it's a montage we have of support for the Jewish people and for Israel. Let's take a look. So, Ben, that last image was of the Brandenburg Gate, which, of course, we saw back in the 30s with Nazi swastikas all over it. And today the Israel flag is emblazoned across it proudly and supportively. I mean, amid all the Jew hating, and you're right, that's what it is, there's also been an amazing outpouring of support.
And that is incredible. And we who are Jews obviously appreciate that. And I would just like to say at the very end here that must be translated into allowing Israel to do what must be done to protect her own citizenry, because goodwill only goes so far as the actual protection of human lives. And if the Jews were to rely on the goodwill of the world over the course of history, it would have gone very poorly for them. That's why the state of Israel exists. It exists so that never again is never again. And in order for that to be a reality, the IDF, the state of Israel, has to be able to defend itself, has to be able to defend its citizenry and protect them from the kind of slaughter and savagery that we saw over the weekend.
Ben Shapiro, thank you very much indeed for your time today. I appreciate it.